Welcome to our special coverage of the funeral for Pope Francis, the 266th head of the Catholic Church, who died on Easter Monday. He was 88 and had served as Pope for just over 12 years. Let's take you to St. Peter's Square in the Vatican City, where thousands have been gathering throughout the morning there. Pope Francis's death, of course, mourned across the globe, and there are 170 foreign dignitaries on the funeral attendance list. Pope Francis was the first pontiff from the Western Hemisphere and the first from South America. And today's service will also break from tradition slightly. The Pope has been lying in state in St. Peter's Basilica. However, the funeral is taking place outside in St. Peter's Square and is due to start at 6 p.m. Australian Eastern Time. Donald Trump, Volodymyr Zelensky, Giorgia Meloni, the Italian PM, and Keir Starmer, her counterpart from the UK, among the heads of state there. Crowds of around 200,000 people also expected to gather. Many will get the chance to pay their respects as the Pope's coffin is transported from the Vatican through the streets of Rome itself to be laid at rest at the Papal Basilica of Santa Maria Maggiore. That's not happened since 1903. Pope Francis had a close connection to that specific basilica. He visited it often, including during the COVID crisis, and also when he left hospital earlier this year after having treatment for double pneumonia. That was his first stop, going there to pray. And after 9 days of mourning, attention will then turn back to the Vatican for the conclave. Cardinals will gather at the Sistine Chapel, where they'll vote to select a new pope. And once the new pontiff is chosen, white smoke will rise from the chapel's chimney and the bells of St. Peter's Basilica will ring. Let's cross live to our correspondent Stash Butler, who's been covering events from the Vatican all week for us. Stash, how's the mood today compared to immediately after the Pope's death?
Well, Alex, I think, in the moments and the days just after the Pope's death, there was certainly, I think, a lot of shock. It was something that happened quite suddenly. I was actually in Rome 2 months ago when the Pope was in hospital with double pneumonia, and every night here in the square there was a rosary prayed for his health. That was a point at which, and we learned subsequently that the Pope was, in fact, quite close to death on a number of occasions during that hospital stay. But then, he emerged, and I think there was a sense that things were returning to normal. Doctors were still telling the Pope to avoid working too hard. He's known as somewhat of a workaholic. But then when the Pope passed away on Easter Monday, as you said, it was quite, I think, a shock to people because it happened, so suddenly, so quickly. There was no hospital stay. His doctor speaking to media saying that, when he came across Pope Francis early on that Monday morning, that really he knew that there was nothing to be done. Now, I've been inside St. Peter's Basilica in the past few days to see the Pope lying in state. There's certainly a really somber mood in there. I mean, it's such a grandiose building. It's really difficult not to be taken in by the emotion of that moment, seeing the Pope lying, his face very pale, in a red robe, in the Basilica, flanked by Swiss Guard on all four corners. And, when I was there, a man in front of me drops to his knees in prayer. And I think that somberness has, carried through to this day. Although I think it's also fair to say a lot of the people here are also very excited to be part of such a historic moment, something that will only take place in a person's lifetime, on a handful of occasions.
Yeah, and obviously a funeral's a time when the person who's passed away, their life is celebrated too. Clearly that's slightly different when it's the Pope, because there is a lot of tradition, a lot of history associated with it. Certain ceremonies and traditions have to be observed and have been many times, the previous 265 occasions that a Pope has come and gone. And the Catholic Church, of course, represented globally. That's why this is a worldwide event. Do you get the sense that mourners are there simply because it's the Pope or a Pope, or because of Pope Francis himself and the reputation he had built up over the last 12 years?
That's a good question. I mean, I think, to be honest, it's because of the nature of this thing that you had the Pope passing away on a Monday and then the funeral just a few days later. I think a lot of the people here were in Rome not necessarily because they knew that the Pope had passed away. We were speaking earlier to some people who were here traveling for the canonization of Carlo Acutis, known as kind of the first millennial saint. Other people were here on pilgrimages hoping to have a private audience with the Pope when they heard the news that he had died. So I think, you know, to some extent, a lot of people are here because the occasion arose while they happened to be in Rome. But at the same time, I think Pope Francis has meant a lot to a lot of people, and that they are, you know, he's someone that has, you know, given across at least a special kind of connection to a lot of the faithful, trying to bridge some of the gaps, trying to make the church as a whole more approachable to ordinary people, rather than being something lofty and removed from believers far away in Rome.
Yeah, and I guess the prestigious list of world leaders at the funeral says everything about the Pope's standing in global affairs. When you've got the US President, the Ukrainian President, Volodymyr Zelensky, PMs from Britain, from Italy as well, Prince William's going to be there. I mean, the Pope's standing globally is every bit as high as it's always been.
That's right. I mean, you know, historically, the papacy was a position that, you know, just a few centuries ago had a lot of, you know, worldly authority as well. It was not something that was purely religious, but the Pope commanded armies, commanded territory, was, you know, much involved in the politics of the time, whereas now certainly is restricted in a sense to more of just a religious, you know, body. But at the same time, I think that the Pope and, you know, the pontificate has this moral authority that I think transcends just the Catholic faith. It's not just Catholics, the 1.4 or so billion Catholics around the world who look to the Pope for spiritual guidance, but I think also other world leaders, people from other religions. I mean, Pope Francis, as a Pope, was also very keen to bridge divides with other religions. You know, he traveled to Asia, meeting with religious leaders from the Muslim faith in Indonesia, and, you know, and I think that it's that moral authority is part of the reason why so many world leaders, you know, see it as, you know, a necessary step really to come to Rome, to come to the Vatican, to pay their respects for this person, this leader who, again, as I said, transcends not just the Catholic faith, but, you know, moves beyond that to really represent a kind of moral authority on a variety of issues for people around the world.
Yeah, he was the first Pope from the Western Hemisphere, the first from Argentina, the first to take the name of Francis after St. Francis of Assisi. And as you say, because of his humble nature, always had an eye for the poor, for the underprivileged, for migrants across the globe as well. So certainly a very different Pope to some that have come before him. And we're going to see this 9-day period of mourning start at the end of the funeral. Will there be any discussion of who the next Pope might be going on in the background, or is it going to be about paying respects and observing that period of mourning before the sort of internal Vatican politics starts?
I think it's fair to say that you speak to any cardinals here, they're very much focused on that period of mourning. As we said, you know, there's not really, I don't think, going to be any discussion, certainly not open discussion of who is going to succeed Pope Francis before those 9 days are up. We don't even have the date for the beginning of the conclave yet, during which those around about 135 cardinal electors will retreat to the Sistine Chapel behind me and begin the process of electing a new pope. I mean, they will tell you, obviously, it is them casting the ballots, but we were, speaking to Cardinal Mykola Bichok, one of the newer cardinals, a cardinal in Melbourne, a bishop, I should say, based in Melbourne, who's, made cardinal just late last year by Pope Francis. He's the youngest cardinal. He'll be one of the few choosing the next pope. He says that really, for the cardinals, they see it as being guided by the Holy Spirit. It's not them directly choosing the cardinals, but choosing the next pope, I should say, but being guided by the Holy Spirit in their choice. That said, there's already been a lot of speculation about who the next pope could be, where they will be from. There's some discussion of whether the papacy should go back to an Italian. It was, with an Italian, or with many Italians throughout the years, but hasn't been for the past 50 or so. Pietro Parolin, the Vatican Secretary of State, seen as one person who might take up that mantle. Also further afield from Asia, the Filipino Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle, also seen called the Asian Pope, rather the Asian Francis by many, seen as a successor to Francis. I mean, speaking of successors to Francis, it's worth pointing out that 80% of cardinal electors have been appointed by Francis himself. So there, perhaps is some security in that, in continuing what what he saw as reforms, changing the church to make it more approachable to the common believer. But equally, we could see someone who strikes some kind of a balance between Pope Francis's camp, seen as more progressive and reforming, and the more traditionalist camp, which sometimes clashed with Pope Francis during his papacy.
Yeah, I read that he appointed around 140 cardinals from non-European countries, that he saw himself as someone that was helping to make the Catholic Church not just broader, as you've outlined to us, Stash, but more international. It's not like the Catholic Church hasn't always been global, it has been. But do you think there is a sense there that Pope Francis was a reformer, or that the hints of radical reform never fully materialised?
I think that's a good question. I think that, the changes that Pope Francis tried to bring about in the Catholic Church, there were some of the more kind of mundane ones involved kind of restructuring the way that the Vatican actually functioned on a kind of day-to-day basis, also restructuring the way that the finances worked and the accounting was done. But I think, there were certainly reforms that he put in place about kind of, reaching out to people, and I think also trying to make the Church's decision-making as a whole a bit more of a kind of collegiate affair, rather than things being sent down from on high, edicts from Rome sent out to the peripheries, as Francis kind of frequently called them, but rather the peripheries informing the way that the Church acted. I mean, there were reforms, I think, that were called for by people involving, the involvement of women in the Church, steps towards perhaps a greater acceptance of LGBTQ people, that were, directions, or rather steps were taken in that direction by the Church, I think, under Francis's reign. But I think it's fair to say that to many people those reforms did not go far enough. So whether it will fall to someone else to take up that mantle and bring those reforms to fruition, or perhaps leave things as they are, I think remains to be seen. I mean, just to give you a sense of how people are feeling here, in Rome, just outside of St. Peter's Cathedral, we spoke to a couple of people lining up and about just the momentousness of the occasion and what it felt like to be involved in this historic moment. Here's where they are.
It's a pretty big event. We came for the canonization of Carlos Acutis. Of course, that didn't happen, so we're going to take advantage of being here for this.
Blessing. It's a blast to be here. It's an opportunity that we couldn't miss.
It's pretty special. We were actually originally coming for, of course, the canonization, and we had prepared like an art piece that we were going to give to Mrs. Acutis, so it's a different, more somber tone, but an incredibly special time with so many people coming to this funeral. So
we're studying all abroad right now, so just to be here at such an enormous moment in history is just a really cool experience.
It's a mixture between excitement and a bit of sadness, because he was a good pope.
It's amazing, like the atmosphere it's like surreal. So all these people here to say goodbye to a person that was really important to Catholic and also to people that are not Catholic.
Well, Stash, I salute you not only for finding enough English speakers in the crowd there in the Vatican City, but also just fascinating to see presumably people from all walks of life saying similar things, not just about the Pope, but about the occasion there. This strange mix of excitement, being there for a moment of history, but also an acknowledgement of what a global figure the Pope was and continues to be whenever the next one is appointed and named. But also just how important he is as the head of a religious body that is still very significant for so many people across the globe.
As you pointed out, there's a bit of a kind of, conflicted emotions about being here, because it is for so many people such a momentous occasion, but equally it is, something that's mourning the death of a man, albeit one that, leads over 1 billion people in their faith. I think that, the strength and I think the emotion that we felt from some of those people there. I mean, not everyone, it's worth pointing out, has been, approving of the steps that Pope Francis has taken during his papacy. He came under a lot of opposition, as I said, from more kind of traditionalist parts of the Catholic Church, who saw him as eroding some of the Church's values, eroding some of the papacy's authority. But at the same time, he had a lot of support. I mean, people in Argentina, his Argentina, obviously delighted to see not a country, but also from South America. But a lot of people, I think, again, taken by the example that Pope Francis gave, speaking of humility in his first, away from Rome, traveling to the Italian island of Lampedusa to meet with migrants there to mourn the migrants from North Africa who died in the Mediterranean Sea, trying to cross to Europe. And that was, things like that, steps like that, going to prisons to wash, to many Christians.
OK, that's Stash Butler. Apologies for the technical difficulties there. I suspect our broadcast is coming from the internet provided by agencies for international broadcasters who are there in numbers to cover this global event. And you can imagine that the requirements and the usage of the internet in that area is probably pretty high right now, with people taking pictures, taking videos, putting it on social media, sending to their friends. As Stash was saying, a strange mix of a somber mood, of bereavement, but also excitement at this moment in history as the 266th Pope is celebrated and mourned at his funeral before being laid to rest in Rome itself to start a 9-day period of mourning.